Now I would like to introduce you our keynote speaker for today, Mr. Todd Litman. So Mr. Litman is founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovation solutions to transport problems. His work helps expand the range of impacts and options considered in transport decision-making, improve evaluation methods, and make specialized technical concepts accessible to a larger audience. His research is used worldwide in transport planning and policy analysis. And on a more personal note, I would like to add that it is a real honor for me to introduce him today because more than a decade ago, when I first encountered road safety, one of the first reports I read was from Todd Litman. And I've been doing road safety since, so talking about next generation today, I think we got a great example right now on the stage, right? So please, Mr. Litman.
So, thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak in front of this wonderful conference. You are members of my tribe. You are a bunch of professional do-gooders. So I'm going to be here. I'm here to speak about some research I'm doing that look at new ways that you can do your job. And I call it a new traffic safety paradigm. And I want to start off showing you one of my favorite walks. This is my front porch. And this is walking down the street. If you are local here, you might recognize walking down Camosun Street down to Vic High, and through the Vic High field to one of my favorite destinations, my local pub. Okay? Is it good that when I am socializing and going to my local pub that I should be able to walk? Is that good? Yes, why? Why is it good that we should live in a neighborhood with a local pub within walking distance? Why? That's right. If this was a room full of traffic engineers, we could point out, for example, that this street is too narrow for heavy traffic. So if everybody was driving to the local pub, we would have to widen that street, and we would have to add more. Tear down some of the local shops to add more parking, and the traffic would be noisy on that little local street. And if I'm walking rather than driving to my local pub, I'm not spending as much money on transportation, which means I have more money to spend on beer. Is that a good thing? Sure, if you're the pub owner. Okay, but there's something. I'm in a room full of traffic safety professionals. What's the additional benefits of somebody walking to a local pub rather than driving? Exactly, I'm not driving home. And so our community is safer, and I'll show you some research that actually validates this. Our community is safer because it's possible to walk to our local pubs. And a lot of your current work, a lot of the current traffic safety effort is intended to discourage people from high-risk driving. So, for example, driving home after drinking. And probably most of the people in this room have worked very hard to promote that message. But how can we expect people to follow through, to actually act on that message, if we aren't doing a good job of ensuring that there are mobility options that make it easy to avoid those high-risk driving? So whether you're talking about anti-drink driving campaigns or anti-distracted driving or graduated licenses that discourage young people from driving or special testing for senior drivers to identify those that are high risk, every time we say you shouldn't drive under these circumstances, we actually have an obligation to say, and here's how you're going to be able to get to what you want without having to drive. And so part of the package of traffic safety efforts has to include not only telling people what not to do, but explaining and making sure that they really do have functional ways to get around without that high-risk driving. So this, very briefly, is the new paradigm. It's about recognizing that exposure, that the amount that people drive is a key traffic risk factor. So if you if you shift from the old current paradigm to the new paradigm, you're expanding your scope. Instead of talking about safer vehicles or just safer roads, you're saying a safer transportation system. And instead of measuring risk per kilometer, say per billion vehicle kilometers or 100,000 vehicles traveling along a road, you measure risk per capita, recognizing that any policy that stimulates more driving is increasing risks, and any strategy that's reducing total driving is probably increasing safety. And so it expands the scope of strategies that we can apply for traffic safety. And another key component of the new paradigm is that we recognize that many of the strategies, many of the vehicle travel reduction strategies, provide significant co-benefits. They are not just safety strategies, but they're also helping to reduce traffic congestion and parking problems and consumer costs and getting people to exercise more. So part of the new traffic safety paradigm is applying more comprehensive analysis that recognizes all of those benefits. Now, let me briefly review some of the reasons that it's time for us to consider the new traffic safety paradigm. This is the Canadian traffic fatality death trends. And you can say that prior to about 2012, 2013, we were doing a pretty good job. There was a steady decline in traffic fatality rates. But in the last few years, the last 5 years, it's plateaued. Here in Canada, in fact, in the US, we've actually seen a significant rise in the past couple years in traffic fatality rates, per capita traffic deaths in the US. Now, why do you think that happened? What is it that kicked in about 2012? Turns out that's when fuel prices started to decline, and that stimulated more driving. So there were record vehicle miles driven in the US, and I think that's true in Canada, although our data are not quite so good. But there's a very clear relationship, and I'll show you some additional research that supports this, that when fuel prices decline, traffic fatalities increase because people are driving more. Okay, now, let's look at it geographically. That was time series, this is geographic. This shows traffic fatality rates for cities around the world. And there are two messages that you can get from this. One is that some of the most, that developing countries tend to have very high traffic fatality rates. So in developing countries, cities, you have traffic fatality rates often more than 20 deaths per 100,000 population. That's very high. And as countries develop, those traffic fatality rates tend to decline. So there's a very good message that implies that the kind of programs that we've been working on, that is improving road design, improving vehicle design, teaching people, convincing people not to drink and drive, those are successful as countries develop. But there's a point, once countries develop, are industrialized, The range of traffic fatality rates varies significantly, and as you'll see, in the sprawled developed countries, you still have fairly high traffic fatality rates, where in the same countries, if you are in a city that is compact and emphasizes transportation demand management, that's TDM, you can get very low traffic fatality rates. Now, let me ask you this. What country do you think has the highest traffic fatality rate among the OECD, among developed countries? Okay, it's right there. The United States. The United States is the most dangerous place to drive. Is that surprising? This explains it. This graph shows the relationship between per capita vehicle travel and traffic fatality rates, per capita traffic fatality rates for various developed countries. So among peer countries, among otherwise similar countries at a similar level of affluence, the relationship is very, very strong between how much people drive and their chance of dying in a car crash. Exposure is a critical risk factor. That's what this says. And let me ask you this. This is Canadian provincial traffic fatality rates. And as you'll see, they vary. That the lowest, which is Ontario, has about a third of the traffic fatality rate as the highest. In the high fatality rate provinces, are there better traffic safety experts in the low traffics in the provinces that have low rates than in high rates? No. You can't blame the people, and you can't blame the transportation agencies, the ministries of transportation. It's structural. It has to do with the travel conditions. Similarly, this happens to be US states. Do you think that the Department of Transportation in, say, New York or Rhode Island is, are they an order of magnitude better than the traffic safety experts in South Carolina, Montana, Mississippi, or Wyoming? What do you think explains an order of magnitude difference between the traffic death rates in these different states? It's mileage. This graph shows, again, the relationship between average per capita vehicle travel and traffic fatality rates for states. And the relationship becomes even stronger when you go to a fine-grained geographic scale. This happens to be urban regions, cities, basically, or cities and the suburbs around them. And again, you get an order of magnitude difference between the highest and the lowest traffic fatality rates. And again, if you look at if you incorporate mileage, you get a very strong, that's an R square of 0.69, which is very strong relationship. You would say that the difference in mileage is a very strong explanation of the difference in traffic fatality rates. Now, in my research, I use various data sets and perspectives. There's another interesting relationship, and that is in cities. Each dot is a North American urban region. In cities, traffic fatality rates are much higher in places where people don't use public transit as much as compared with cities where people that are much more transit oriented. And it's actually a fairly small difference in transit ridership. So you're going from, from under 50 to more than 100 trips per year, which is still only like 5% of total trips shifting from driving to public transit, has this huge impact on reducing traffic fatality rates. And what's really interesting is I was able to get some data that disaggregated this by age, and the relationship is particularly strong, a stronger R squared much stronger R-squared for youths compared with overall. And what that suggests is that young people want to reduce their mileage and their exposure, but they can only do so if they live in a community that has good travel options. If you bring up your children living in an automobile-dependent, sprawled neighborhood, when your son turns 16, you buy him a car because you're tired of chauffeuring him everywhere. But I can speak from personal experience. We raised 2 sons in a walkable urban neighborhood here in Victoria, and neither of them got their driver's license until they were in their 20s, and our older son got a car when he was 24. So and our younger son hasn't even purchased a car yet. We avoided 6 or 8 years of high-risk driving because we live in a walkable neighborhood. And our children had wonderful independence because of where they live, because they live in a safe area. Okay, so another way to describe this is we can talk about sprawl versus smart growth. So sprawl is automobile-dependent, low-density urban fringe development. Smart growth is compact, multimodal development. This graph comes from a part of a series of studies that was done rating U.S. counties and cities according to a sprawl index. The graph, the blue columns show the per capita traffic fatality rates for the 10 smartest growth counties, and on the right are the traffic fatality rates of the 10 most sprawled counties. Somebody who's taken a course in statistics, tell us what you get if you live in a smart growth compact community. What do you get? People who are alive. More of them. This is, I think, is very important because there's a lot of advocacy about smart growth. Smart growth is advocated as a way to reduce public infrastructure costs, so it doesn't cost as much to provide homes with water and sewage and roads and emergency response. And it's advocated as a environmental strategy, reducing climate change emissions. But how often do you hear people advocate more compact, multimodal development as a traffic safety strategy or as a public health strategy? And yet, my research suggests that that's actually one of the biggest benefits, that there's a very positive message. A lot of people do want to live in compact, walkable neighborhoods. The real estate research shows there's a lot of demand for a lot of households who want to live in those compact neighborhoods, and we're understanding more and more of the benefits. But you almost never hear people talk about the safety benefits. And that is our responsibility. We can add to the discussion of the benefits of living in a walkable, smart growth neighborhood by adding safety. Okay, there's sometimes a discussion about this, skepticism, because people say, yeah, but in walking and bicycling and motorcycling have very high traffic fatality rates per mile traveled, and therefore if we're encouraging people to drive less and rely more on active modes, we're increasing risk. But that's not what the research indicates. There's good research on what we call safety in numbers, which indicates that as a community becomes more walkable, that as walking and bicycling increases in a community, traffic fatality rates go way down. There are a number of reasons for this. We suspect it's partly because the factors that create a walkable community also increase safety, things like narrower roads with lower design speeds, more connected streets, higher density, more mixed use. And it's also because you have a very different perspective on safety if you look at risk from a community perspective than from an individual's perspective. So if I shift from driving to, let's say, bicycling, it's possible if I'm if I'm a relatively poor bicyclist, I might be incurring more risk myself. Now, in most cases, that's not true, but it's possible. But I'm imposing less risk on other road users. And so the calculus of traffic safety, if you use a comprehensive perspective, so you're looking at it from a community perspective, shifts from driving to walking and cycling very clearly provides significant safety benefits. Now I'm going to take a little detour here because I've been doing quite a bit of research recently on autonomous vehicles and their implications for transport planning. And for some reason, this is the hot issue. And so I've been invited to speak at many conferences recently on this subject. So let's bring this in. How will autonomous vehicles affect people's lives and planning issues such as crash rates? Well, the optimists say 90% of all crashes are caused by human error. Human error contributes to 90% of all crashes. Therefore, autonomous vehicles will reduce crash rates by 90%. What does that statement overlook? Okay. When's the last time your computer or the internet or your mobile phone failed to deliver the service that you expected? Has that ever happened? Okay. Did anybody die when that happened? No, thank goodness. But if that computer or internet connection or mobile phone was driving your car, it could have been very severe. Okay, so there are a number of additional possible risks associated with autonomous vehicles: hardware and software failures, malicious hacking, increased risk-taking. So let's say a pedestrian knows that all the cars driving around are autonomous. Are they going to start taking more risk on the assumption that the cars are going to watch out for them better? Platooning risk. So many of the benefits associated with autonomous vehicles require the vehicles to drive very close together, within a meter or two of each other, to create platoons, and they will communicate with each other. And I suspect that that introduces very significant additional risks. If cars are traveling, we tell people maintain 1 car length for each 10 kilometers an hour, which means many meters between cars. We call that shy distance. And if cars are platooning, if one of the cars in the front of the platoon has a critical failure, it could create a multi-vehicle crash that without platooning would have been 1 or 2 vehicles. Suddenly you've got 5 or 10 vehicles involved. So I think that there are some very severe risks associated with platooning, and there could be more crashes simply because people are driving more. So there's a lot of discussion among experts as to whether autonomous technology will increase or reduce total vehicle travel. And there are ways that it can increase travel, ways that it can reduce it, and a lot of it is contingent based on public policy. So if our public policies don't discourage driving as autonomous vehicles come in, it'll actually be cheaper for a typical car to drop you off at work and just keep driving around the block continuously until you call it, because it's cheaper to do that than it is to pay for a parking space. And so that and many other things, you could see much more sprawl, and you could see all those empty vehicle miles. We could end up with an awful lot more driving and actually a lot more traffic congestion. So one of the messages of, if we want to maximize the benefits of autonomous vehicles, we really need to price roads efficiently. Okay, so I don't have time to go into the detailed benefit cost analysis, but there are a number of benefits, both to users and to society, and there are a bunch of costs and problems, both to users and society. And so there's a movement now to, among progressive transportation planners, to emphasize shared autonomous vehicles, that autonomous vehicles should be managed so that it doesn't increase total vehicle travel, and it does favor lower income people and does some other things. So anyway, my conclusion is that the benefits, costs, and travel impacts of autonomous vehicles are uncertain, and the net benefits are probably going to be smaller than what the optimists predict. Recent predictions that autonomous vehicles will soon be cheap and ubiquitous, and by 2030 will displace most private vehicle travel, are mostly made by people with a financial interest in the industry, and there's good reason to be skeptical. During the 2020s and 2030s, autonomous vehicles are likely to be expensive and limited in ability. For example, it's going to be many years before autonomous vehicles can drive in heavy rain or snow. Would you be willing to pay a lot extra, let's say an extra $5,000 or $10,000 for a car that doesn't operate in snow if you live in Canada? Okay, so, and it'll probably be 2040s or 2050s, maybe even 2060s, before autonomous vehicles are affordable to lower income households. And so, according to, if you accept the analysis I've done, it's unlikely that most vehicles will be autonomous before 2050. So I'm not saying there won't be significant benefits. I'm not saying there won't be some safety benefits. I'm not saying that eventually they're not going to be common, but I suspect that it will take longer and the net benefits will be smaller than some optimists predict. So, my work on the new paradigm traffic safety identifies a number of additional safety strategies that we can think about now if we use this new approach and recognize exposure as a key risk factor. So you could work with your transportation engineers and planners to encourage more multimodal planning, improving walking, cycling, and public transit. Things like complete streets policies at the local level. More efficient transportation pricing I think, it's really the low-hanging fruit. If you want safety, one of the best things you could do is advocate for road pricing, distance-based vehicle insurance pricing, increased fuel taxes, and increased parking pricing. Those are very effective ways to increase safety. Reduce parking supply and subsidies, smart growth development policies, complete streets policies, and transportation demand management programs are all additional safety strategies that you can consider using the new paradigm. Let me mention what I think is the best traffic safety strategy that you've probably never heard of, and that is changing the way we price vehicle insurance and registration fees, what we call pay-as-you-drive insurance. So instead of your broker quoting you premiums per vehicle year, with pay-as-you-drive, you're quoted your premium per vehicle kilometer. So rather than saying you're going to pay $600 a year, your broker would say you're going to pay 3 cents a kilometer. And at the beginning and the end of the policy term, you get a verified odometer reading. So you could, in the states, companies that do this, they simply have you take a photo, a digital photo of your odometer reading, and that becomes the basis for calculating your premium at the end of the term. This gives motorists a very significant incentive to reduce their mileage. And because it incorporates all existing risk factors, the higher risk driver, the one that's paying, let's say, $2,000 or $3,000 a year, would pay several times more per kilometer than the low risk driver who's only paying $300 or $400 a year. And so the higher risk driver would have a much greater incentive to reduce their mileage. The research that we've done suggests that on average, shifting totally to pay-as-you-drive insurance would reduce vehicle mileage by about 10%. You would get about a 10% reduction in total vehicle travel, and you would get somewhere between 15 and 17% reduction in vehicle fatalities because of that. Highest risk drivers would have the greatest incentive to reduce their mileage. It's also a great strategy for increasing insurance affordability and for reducing climate change emissions. Now, as I mentioned, part of the new paradigm is more comprehensive analysis. So I often use a matrix like this where we identify a number of planning objectives, that is, things that your community wants to achieve. And if we expand highways, generally you're achieving one planning objective. You're reducing traffic congestion. But does expanding highways reduce parking problems? Does expanding highways reduce consumer costs, or improve mobility for non-drivers, or increase safety? It doesn't. Improving highways, there are safety strategies that you can do on a highway, but simply expanding a highway does not increase safety. And if we get people to drive more fuel-efficient vehicles, we're doing nothing to reduce traffic congestion or parking costs or consumer costs or accidents, but we are reducing energy consumption and pollution. And if we implement the typical traffic safety strategies, say more barriers along the roadway or safer vehicles, we're increasing traffic safety, but we're generally not doing anything to reduce traffic congestion or parking problems or consumer costs. But if we get people to drive less and live in more compact communities, we're achieving virtually all of those planning objectives. And so it's from this perspective that strategies such as multimodal planning, efficient transportation pricing, transportation demand management, they are strongly justified when you use a comprehensive analysis framework. Now, safety experts have a particular role to play in this because if you monetize, that is, measure in monetary units many of these objectives or impacts, it turns out traffic accidents are one of the biggest costs of the transportation system. And interestingly, traffic congestion and air pollution are actually relatively minor. So we have a lot of policy people saying we should encourage public transit ridership, we should create more walkable communities, we should implement congestion pricing to reduce congestion or to reduce climate change emissions. And the safety impacts are often overlooked. And that's important because some strategies for reducing congestion or pollution also help increase safety, and some reduce safety. And so, for example, you would say a congestion reduction strategy, let's say a policy reform that reduces traffic congestion by 50%, but increases traffic accidents by 10%, is probably not cost effective because the value of the congestion reduction is more than offset by the increased accidents. But a congestion reduction strategy that also reduces accidents is worth far more because of that large cost of accidents. Now, just for fun, I looked at a number of conventional traffic safety reports and programs, and I evaluated the degree to which they recognize the new paradigm strategies. And briefly, most of them didn't consider it at all. Most traffic safety programs and documents, they'll tell you don't drink and drive, don't get distracted while you're driving, young people should have graduated licenses, we want to discourage, help seniors reduce their driving. We're going to do all these things to reduce high-risk driving, but almost none of them, or let's say only a minority, even recognize the importance of improving walking and cycling in public transit, and almost none of them mention pricing reforms, and almost none of them mention smart growth. And if they did mention public transit, they're very vague about it. You know, some of these documents, they give you models or methods for calculating the safety benefits of conventional strategies. None of them included any tools for calculating the impacts and safety benefits of, say, improving public transit or a pricing reform, even though that's what we need right now. Those are the tools that we need. So let me give you a quick example. Especially if you live on Vancouver Island, you've probably driven the Malahat. That's the road between Victoria and Nanaimo. It's kind of a bottleneck. We've recently, just in the last 2 weeks, we've had 2 fatal accidents. So there's been a lot of discussion. How can we reduce risk on the Malahat? And pretty much every decade, the Ministry of Transportation, the BC Ministry of Transportation, does a study and looks at ways to reduce traffic problems on the Malahat. But the way the study is framed, it only allows impacts on the Malahat to be considered. So it analyzes ways to reduce traffic congestion and accidents on the Malahat. And it ignores upstream and downstream safety impacts and congestion impacts. It gives no consideration to the mobility needs for non-drivers. So it assumes that the only people traveling on the, or who want to travel on this corridor all have a car. And there has been no comprehensive multimodal analysis. So I did that. And I came up with a multimodal Malahat solution. And right now, there are 3 buses a day that go between Nanaimo and Victoria. And there's no way, if I want to do some business in Nanaimo, I can't take a bus up to Nanaimo in the morning, get my business done, and still get home that evening by bus. Public transportation is terrible on that corridor. If we had 30 to 60 minute headways going up and down all day, and the bus fares were relatively inexpensive, and it was integrated with a commute trip reduction program, and fortunately we are building bus lanes on part of the approach corridors, and you improve the user information and marketing, I believe we would get a 10 to 20% mode shift, that 10 to 20% of the people who are currently driving a car over the Malahat would be attracted to very high quality bus service. The buses should be coach buses with onboard Wi-Fi service, onboard washrooms, and preferably onboard cappuccino machines. Okay, if we had, let's optimistically say that using this strategy, we are able to shift 15% of current car trips to public transit over that corridor. What do you think that would do for traffic accidents on that corridor? Do you think you would get a 15% reduction in accident risk? I would think at least. In fact, I think that there are a number of high-risk drivers, people who are either tired after the long day of work, or seniors who are coming from, say, over the Malahat to Victoria to visit family or for medical treatments, who would love to have an alternative to driving their own car. But they don't have it right now. And those are high-risk drivers, and I suspect that if we were able to achieve a 15% reduction in mileage on that corridor by improving alternatives, but it was weighted toward higher risk drivers, you would see more than a 15% reduction in crashes on that corridor. But the way that the analysis is usually presented, it doesn't allow those safety benefits to be considered. The only thing that we currently measure is crash risk per vehicle kilometer over the Malahat, not per capita, not total trips. Okay, so that was just one example. We could have done a lot of other examples of how current planning overlooks these safety impacts. I want to emphasize this is not anti-car. It's no more anti-car than a healthy diet is anti-food. It's about offering travelers options. And so that supports what you are trying to do. You're trying to discourage some high-risk driving, and in order to do that, we need to think about what are the alternatives. And these strategies, motorists benefit from these strategies because they experience reduced traffic and parking congestion, they get the increased safety. It improves mobility options for non-drivers, which reduces drivers' chauffeuring burdens. It's often much faster. We could have hourly bus service going over the Malahat in a couple months. It would take I suspect at least 5 years, maybe 10 years, if we're going to widen that road and do substantial roadway changes. Okay, I do want to emphasize what I'm talking about is not radical. This is standard practice among most transportation professionals. So, quick conclusions: traffic death rates are increasing. Additional safety strategies are needed to achieve ambitious safety goals such as Vision Zero. New research improves our understanding of traffic risks. Numerous studies indicate that exposure, the amount people travel, is a critical risk factor. All else being equal, increased travel increases crashes. A new paradigm recognizes that all vehicle travel incurs risks. So policies that stimulate vehicle travel increase crashes, and those that reduce travel provide safety. New safety strategies complement existing programs, which become more effective, equitable, and acceptable if implemented with improved mobility options that help higher-risk travelers reduce their driving and risk exposure. New safety strategies tend to provide co-benefits, and so are supported by comprehensive analysis. Now, I just want to include a couple a list of some of the research. These are peer-reviewed studies on the effects of pricing on traffic safety and the effects of improving alternative modes and smart growth on safety. And if you want more information, the current Transportation Talk, which is the journal of the Canadian Institute of Transportation Engineers, has an article by me called A New Traffic Safety Paradigm. It's available free on the internet. And if you want more information, visit our website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute website. There's a more detailed report of my research, and I have my business cards. Let's exchange business cards. I want to thank you very much, and I'm happy to stick around if there are any questions.